Let's talk about one of the most incredible, yet somehow half-forgotten logistical operations in all of World War II. We're talking about a lifeline that stretched across killer seas and entire continents. And honestly, without it, the outcome of the war could have been completely different.
So what was this secret lifeline? What was this thing that fueled the Soviet war machine when it was literally on the brink of collapse? Well, the answer is a story of unbelievable scale, terrifying danger, and a surprising alliance that would end up changing the world.
Okay, first up, a front on the brink. To really get why this lifeline was so absolutely critical, we have to rewind to the very beginning, to the truly desperate situation the Soviet Union found itself in.
Picture this. It's June 1941. Germany launches its massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The speed of the German advance is just devastating. The Red Army is reeling, getting pushed back and back. By November, things look incredibly bleak. That's when the United States, seeing this catastrophe unfolding, formally stepped in to help.
And you have to understand, the stakes here were astronomical. The Allies knew that keeping the Soviets in the fight was absolutely essential. Why? Because that massive front tied down millions of German soldiers. If the USSR collapsed, Germany could pivot its entire military might westward, and the war in Europe could very well be lost.
All right, Section 2, America's arsenal opens. Faced with this potential disaster, the United States came up with a solution on a scale nobody had ever seen before. It basically transformed itself into what was called the arsenal of democracy.
The engine for all this support was the Lend-Lease program. And the core idea here was pretty revolutionary for the time. It let the U.S. supply its allies with everything, tanks, planes, food, you name it, without asking for cash up front. This was a huge shift away from American isolationism and toward active global support.
And we're not just talking about guns and bullets here. The aid was incredibly comprehensive. Of course, there was a ton of military hardware, but just as vital were things like food and clothing, and maybe most importantly, raw materials and industrial equipment that allowed the Soviet war machine to literally rebuild itself while it was still fighting.
So having the supplies is one thing, but actually getting them there, that was a whole other problem. And this next part of the story, well, it's one of unbelievable courage, incredible hardship, and just constant mortal danger.
You know, Winston Churchill had a real knack for words, and he summed it up perfectly. When he was talking about the Arctic convoys, one of the main supply routes, he called it simply the worst journey in the world. He wasn't exaggerating.
There were basically three main routes, and let me tell you, none of them were a walk in the park. The Arctic convoys had to deal with German U-boats, bomber planes, and just the most brutal weather you can imagine. The Persian Corridor through Iran was safer from attack, but it was a logistical nightmare. And the Pacific route? Well, that meant Soviet ships had to sneak through waters crawling with the Japanese Navy.
So just try to put yourself in the shoes of a sailor on one of these convoys. You weren't just fighting the enemy, you were fighting the planet. The North Atlantic has some of the roughest seas in the world, and in the winter, the ice would force the ships closer and closer to German air bases in Norway, making them sitting ducks.
And the cost? I mean, it was just staggering. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank ships carrying over 6.3 million tons of Allied cargo. Every single jeep, every can of food, every bullet that made it through was paid for with incredible risk and, all too often, with human lives.
But here's the thing. Despite all those horrific losses, the supplies that did make it through had a profound, absolutely decisive impact on the war on the Eastern Front. You see, the aid was so smart because it filled these critical gaps. With the Allies sending things like trucks, trains, and raw materials, Soviet factories could focus on what they did best, just churning out T-34 tanks and artillery pieces. This support was the absolute key to motorizing the Red Army, giving it the speed and mobility it desperately needed to start pushing back. And the numbers, the sheer scale of it all, is just mind-boggling. The Allies sent over 12,000 aircraft.
Nearly 13,000 tanks, which was a huge supplement to their own production.
And maybe the most important number of all, over 300,000 trucks. These American trucks became the backbone of Red Army logistics. They gave Soviet troops a level of mobility that the Germans, by the later stages of the war, just couldn't hope to match.
But it wasn't just about the finished goods. The aid had this incredible knock-on effect. For instance, the U.S. didn't just send fuel. They sent entire oil refineries. And what did that do? It allowed Soviet aviation fuel production to just explode, from about 110,000 tons in 1941 to over 1.6 million by 1944. And more fuel means more planes in the sky, a huge factor in winning the war.
And yet, this is where the story of this incredible cooperation takes a deeply ironic twist. The very same logistical power that helped win the war would very soon come to define a brand new global conflict.
Talk about whiplash. During the war, you had this amazing peak of cooperation between these two completely different systems. But almost as soon as the war was over, that partnership completely fractured. The two superpowers that fought together became locked in a new, decades-long struggle, the Cold War.
Just a year later, by 1946, that divide was a chasm. Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech basically signaled the official end of the wartime alliance. It marked the beginning of a new reality where the world was split into two hostile camps, led by the very same nations that had just fought side by side to save it.
And all of this really leaves you with a big, lingering question, doesn't it? The Lend-Lease program was this amazing testament to what nations can achieve when they're staring down a common enemy. But it's also a pretty stark reminder of how fragile those bonds can be. It really makes you wonder, can alliances forged in a crisis ever really last once that crisis is over?